Welcome back to the Snap Ag YouTube channel. Today we're going to be going over the first pillar in the 4 pillars that make up growing plants well, soil chemistry. Now I want to start out by asking you a question. What does Harvard University have in common with soil tests? It's like Harvard Universities and soils. It's like this just doesn't jive. Well, they are similar in one way, and that is the principle of endowments. Okay? Now, how an endowment works is that a big bunch of rich people get together and they give money to an organization like Harvard University, and then the Harvard University invests that money, and then the interest that money earns based on the investment comes back to the university, and that's used for the operating expenses for the university. A soil is very much the same way. Harvard University, I believe, has a $38 billion endowment. But they don't see all that money because it isn't an endowment. They only see the interest payout. And so there are basically 2 different types of soil tests that are usually used in agriculture, okay, to manage soil chemistry. One is what I call, most labs are not going to call it this, okay, but this is what I call it because it kind of gets the thought across. A projected soil test. It's very similar to an endowment. It's a big amount of money, and it's going to leach basically nutrients into the soil solution at a much lower rate, and then that's actually what the plants pick up. So think of Harvard University as the plant. Harvard University doesn't see the 38 billion, they just see a small subset of that every year, and that's what the plant sees. And so based on the quality of the investments will depend on what Harvard actually gets out. Even though there's $38 billion, it doesn't mean that they're going to get a consistent outpay in interest, because it just depends on how the markets do and how good the investments are. And the same thing is for the plant. Just because you have a large endowment in the soil doesn't necessarily mean it's going to come through and the plant's actually going to see that. And that's where this test comes into place. It's called a management soil test, or at least what I call it. That's what I call it. So what I use is called a saturated paste analysis, and we're going to go more into that, but it's something that you can use where it's like, that crop doesn't look right. Let me take a test. That's what we use a management test for. And we don't test as many elements in a management test as we do in an endowment or a projected test, but it's enough of the major elements that are getting used up by the plant that we're going to keep track of them. Okay, but before we go into actual, the nitty-gritty on the projected test and on the management soil test, I want to get you a little bit more familiar just with the elements and their names and what we're going to be actually working with and what you're going to be seeing on a test. So just give me a second here. I'm going to erase this, and we're going to go through what we call the big 3, okay? And I think we're going to put these up on slides. So the big 3 plus 1, the middle 3, and the 5 dwarves. So what are we talking about here? So the big 3 plus 1, and I'm just going to use their element symbols just so that it's a little bit easier for me to write them up here. So whether you see it on the slide or not, but I'm just going to write them up here. The big 3 are nitrogen, okay, phosphorus, and potassium. These are what we considered our primary elements. Now the plus 1 here is sulfur, okay? So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, okay? These are our primary elements. They're the most important elements that we try to manage in the soil. They're used in very large quantities in the crop, and so that's why they're considered primary. Our next thing is, and I'll just put here, the big 3 plus 1. Okay, so then the middle 3 are going to be calcium, magnesium, and sodium, Na, okay? These are the middle 3 that we test for, okay? And then we're going to go through the 5 dwarves. 5 I'm a terrible speller. Dwarves, okay? Which are, I'm just gonna get them up here. Boron, iron, Fe, might have seen that on a bottle or something somewhere. Manganese, okay? Copper, and zinc. Okay, so these are the elements that we really are going to be managing on a regular basis. Obviously, the big 3 plus 1 more so than the middle 3, and then obviously these guys are going to be a lot less. Okay, so just so you get a picture here of the elements that you're going to see coming up and up and up again if you're trying to manage the chemistry in your soil based on taking soil tests. Okay, now the question is, right? So okay, I'm Harvard University. I run a big school, and I need a big enough endowment to be able to support that school. So then you would ask yourself, I'm a gardener or I'm a farmer. I'm trying to support all these plants. So how much nutrients do I need to actually get a large enough endowment for each of these elements to support the plants? Okay, and that's where obviously taking a soil test is going to come into place. We're going to go over the basics of taking a soil test. So one thing, and I'll explain this a little bit more later, but when we're taking a soil test, let's say that this is the soil here. I want to talk a little bit about depth, okay? So most people in agriculture will only test to a 6-inch depth. This is called a plow layer, okay? Plow layer. And one thing to note, and I'll bring this up again in the future, is that every 6 inches that you go in your soil depth, the weight, the pounds to make up this layer of soil over an entire acre is 2 million pounds. And that's going to be very important later because it's going to help us calculate if we want to make, let's say we're deficient a certain amount, we're going to need to know this number so that we can calculate the amendment application correctly so that it makes enough to make the change that we want to have happen. So I recommend a 6-inch depth for sampling. One is that most tillers can't really till more than 6 inches, so if you're incorporating the fertilizer, you really can't get it much deeper than 6 inches. Number 2 is it's in what's called the aerobic zone, which is where the majority of your microbes are going to be and where the majority of your root hairs that are actually going to take up nutrients are going to be. So it doesn't really make much sense to me to amend much lower than this because this is really where all the action is happening. Now, it's very important that we take a consistent soil depth, and we actually, at our farm, we actually have a soil probe, which we'll put a picture up so that you can see it, and I actually mark it at 6 inches, so I'm consistently taking a 6-inch depth. Because if I go deeper than that and pull up something, let's say from the subsoil, let's say it's more deficient down here because we've added all the fertilizer up here, it might show that the number as far as what I need to apply is lower than what it actually is because I'm actually punching into soil that I have never amended or have amended much less. So having a very consistent depth is going to be very important as well. The other question is how many soil samples should I take? And so if I'm interested in sending a soil test into a lab, we use a 1/2-inch soil sampler, and we'll put a picture up on this for you to see. And I take 6 samples over the area that I'm interested in. You could do as much as an acre or 2 with that if it's all the same, but I will usually make it much smaller than that. It just depends if you've amended in a place before or you haven't. So let's say that it's my first time to getting out on a piece of land. I know that my soil type is roughly the same, like I don't have a patch of clay over here or something over there, then I'll just test it all to just get a beginning idea. But once I start amending, let's say I put a little more calcium over here because a crop needed it or something like that, then I'll start sampling separately as I start doing different things to different places in my garden or in my farm. So you're just gonna have to be aware of what you've done in a location in the past and make sure that you don't mix up areas so that you kind of get a consistent idea of what's going on. But 6 samples is about what you want to do per sample, so that there's enough that you're sending into the lab so that they can do a good job. So just a basic rule of thumb is smaller and more is better, because the smaller the area that you're doing, just the more accurate it's going to be for that area. A minimum of 6 probes to the area, and you want to have around a pound of soil to actually send off to the lab. And this is primarily for that projected soil test that we were talking about. Now, areas where not to sample. You want to avoid things like eroded hillsides or low spots, ditches near gravel roads, or fence lines that could cause a test to get off. You don't want to obviously test where an animal just went doo-doo or something like that, because that could affect the results. And if there's been a fertilizer or some sort of spill of some sort of chemical, obviously don't test there as well, so that it doesn't affect the analysis. Okay. Now, the other thing that you're going to want to do is that when you put this like in a Ziploc or something like that, it needs to be a new Ziploc. You can't use a used Ziploc, because sometimes the food, if you had it in the Ziploc, could cause the test to be whacked out. And so a new Ziploc, and then make sure to mark it appropriately, and so that you know where it came from, and then also make a log where you can put in the marking or the ID for that bag, so that you know when you get the soil test back that you know the area that it is actually for. Okay, so that's it for soil testing. So we went over basically how the soil is like Harvard, the basic elements that we're going to be working through, and then we also went over soil testing depth, the reason for that, how many samples, places to avoid, and how to package and ID your sample before you send it off to the lab. The next class is we're going to talk about laboratories to send it off to for the projected soil test, and then we'll do another one on the management soil test that we use on our farm on kind of more of a daily basis to manage during the growing season. So hopefully that was helpful and gets you started on the beginning of soil chemistry and how to manage it. Bye.